everyone. Thank you to the thank you and welcome to the first 2021 virtual community meeting. As you all know, we started this, last year at the onset of COVID-19 as a way to stay connected to each other, keep you and all of our supporters, our advocates, our partners connected to the program and the services and the activities that were happening both at the Trust and at the Skid Row community at large. So very excited to kick this program off again this year, and with a very exciting speaker that we're going to be having a Q&A session with. Just as a quick update, we want to thank our teams out in the field. So a very special thank you to our property management team that really hung tough during a very difficult year through COVID and a lot of the activities that happened out in the field. And also heading into 2021, kind of holding the line out there. In addition to that, thank you very much to the Health and Social Services team for trying to balance working and sheltering in place with serving the resident needs in our population, and really looking forward to your full-time integration back into the organization for our residents that really kind of need your presence and interaction. Thank you to our advancement team for always continuing to make sure that our voices are heard out, in our industry, in our community, and in the larger world. And thank you to, again, like all of just the team members and our partners that are out there doing what they do so that we can continue doing what we do. So with that, I am going to introduce our very exciting speaker today. I'm going to be transitioning to video and just give an intro, very quick intro. So in the mid-'80s, Maria Foscarinis was a litigator at Sullivan and Cromwell, which was a very large, influential corporate law firm. She volunteered to represent homeless families on a pro bono basis. And then after seeing the impact of the first-rate legal advocacy on the lives of homeless people, she left that firm and dedicated herself to that work full-time. In 1989, she established the Law Center with one goal in mind: ending homelessness in America. Maria is a primary architect of the landmark Stewart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act, the first major federal legislation addressing homelessness. She's litigated precedent-setting cases to secure the legal rights of homeless persons. She's also developed major initiatives, including most recently the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. She's testified repeatedly before Congress, published dozens of articles, book chapters, and opinion pieces, speaks regularly about legal and policy issues affecting homelessness, and is frequently quoted in the media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, NPR, Bloomberg, and the BBC. Maria has been profiled in publications including the New York Times Sunday Magazine, LA Times, Washington, and most recently the English language edition of Kahamarini, a major daily. We're very honored that she's joined us today. He has been an advocate, a supporting partner just in all of the cause and mission that we're all committed to. So I just want to take the time out to say thank you very, very much, for joining us. I'm honored that you're here. We're honored that we're excited to hear, what you have to say in this Q&A session, and also just to kind of kick off this really, I think, influential and changing year. So couldn't be happier, and again, more excited and proud that you're going to help us do that. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for, lending your experience, your voice, and your expertise.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lee, for having me, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. I really appreciate your asking me to participate with you in this conversation, and so much appreciate everything you do. This is, we could not be effective without the work and energy of you and all of our partners around the country. So really appreciate everything you do. This is something we have to work together on. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. So just as like a quick background for everyone listening right now, you began your career as a corporate litigator. Can you share a little bit more about what prompted your transition from kind of, you know, where you were to advocating on behalf of homelessness, homeless individuals, homeless families, and then after that, what prompted you to create the National Homelessness Law Center?
So I was a litigator in a large corporate law firm in New York, and I volunteered to take a pro bono case. I had in mind going to law school that I wanted to use my law degree to make change, to make positive change, to advance social justice. But I really didn't know how. And at the firm, I had this opportunity to take a pro bono case representing homeless families who had been denied emergency shelter. And that really gave me a firsthand view of how I could make a difference as a lawyer. It made a big impact on me. I traveled, my clients were living in a wealthy suburb of New York City where I'd been many times, but I'd never seen the deep pockets of deep poverty that were there in the midst of plenty. And there were whole families living in single basement rooms without floorboards, with exposed wiring, with kids, families living in their cars. And I worked with a legal services lawyer and with an advocacy group in the city, and just it made a powerful impact on me as a young lawyer then, that I could really make a difference by standing up in court and using my legal skills on behalf of these families. And it was a class action. So it was the feeling of, you know, representing these families, but also making bigger systemic reform. And that was very exciting. And the clients I was representing at the firm were Goldman Sachs and, you know, big clients. They would have no trouble finding somebody to replace me. But these families needed me and I could really make a difference. So that became the way in for me. And this was the mid-'80s. This was when homelessness was first becoming a national crisis, and it was an opportunity to leave the firm, go to Washington, and organize a campaign for a federal response. And so that's what I did. I founded the Law Center because I wanted to create a place where other people, other lawyers, could also contribute their skills and use the power of the law. Law is a very powerful tool, and there's a reason big corporate firms have legions of lawyers representing their interests, and poor people and people who are homeless don't. And so we mobilize a lot of volunteer lawyers ourselves. So that's the mission of the Law Center, is to use the power of the law.
Yeah, we were talking about you when we were preparing for, this virtual community meeting, and one of the things that stood out to us at the Trust and some of the things that you highlighted was the fact that you understood homelessness, you knew about it, you knew the effect and impact, and that's a very powerful thing. But it's even more powerful when you go and you see it. Like pictures move you and tell the story and prompt you to action, but there's nothing like actually walking into the community and seeing the effect it has on people, on others, on the community at large. And if pictures move you when you're actually in the community, it's almost overwhelming. That that feeling that kind of prompts you to action. So that really stood out, that you went there, you looked at what, the effect and impact that was happening. And then equally so, because people often don't know what to do or how to do it, especially when the challenge is so big or so impactful. And you took your very specific skills. Someone like maybe with marketing is different or technology is different, but you took your skills, your gift, and figured out how you were going to affect change, you know, in something that you saw firsthand and experienced. So, I mean, it was just not only is your story moving, but you are moving in the way that you came about it, you know, and that you've been at it, you know, year after year for a very long time. So, I just wanted to share that, like kind of on behalf of the team. And when we were talking about you, is just the story of you really kind of like I said, seeing firsthand, you know, like you went there and then you taking your actions and your gifts and your skills and using them firsthand. So that was really interesting. So I'm glad you touched upon that, you know, in your answer just now. Second question, the National Homelessness Law Center is the only national organization dedicated solely to using the law, like you had said before, to end and prevent homelessness. It also protects the rights of people experiencing homelessness. What are the law-based issues your organization primarily focuses on?
So these can shift over time, but they fall into some categories. So one category is protecting rights from being denied. So right now, for example, we're spending a lot of time and effort fighting bad laws, fighting laws that make it a crime to be homeless. So we're spending a lot of time in court and in the policy context, challenging laws that criminalize homelessness. This is a kind of a defensive posture, which we don't like to be in. We'd rather be in a proactive, offensive posture. So, you know, with our work to defend people's rights, we're also advocating for housing. So we have a campaign, I think you mentioned earlier, called Housing Not Handcuffs. And the idea is we're fighting these laws that criminalize people for being homeless, but we're not just doing that, because we're not advocating for people's right to live on the street. People should not have to live on the street. We're advocating for housing.
Right.
So try deliberately to tie these two things together, housing, not handcuffs. So we're fighting criminalization, but we're also advocating for housing in a variety of ways. We're advocating for housing rights. We're advocating ultimately for the human right to housing. And then just to give you another example, and this is a more proactive, this is us trying to enforce and make sure that an existing right is complied with, an existing statutory right. So homeless children have a right to education. They have the right to go to school. They can't be denied access to school simply because they don't have an address. And this is a right protected under it's now called the Mckinney-Vento Act. And so we protect that right. We have litigated and advocated to enforce that right for homeless kids. So those are two examples of kind of issue areas that we're active in. And I should also say our work is not just, you know, when people think about law, they think about going to court, and we view law broadly. So you can also make a powerful impact by making new laws, going to Congress, going to state and local legislative bodies. So we work in those arenas as well.
Yeah, you know, it's again, just picking out your words of wisdom and the answers that you have is we often talk about, not as it relates to this meeting that we're having today, but just the difference in being on your heels, right, and kind of fighting for existing rights, or when you get backed into a corner, or when you have to, like, you know, advocate back. Very different than when you're on your toes and you're trying to get ahead of something, and you're trying to get ahead of the change because you don't want it to end up somewhere. And typically firms or organizations are really good at one. They're either better at the reactionary posture, or they're better at the proactive posture. And, you know, people like you, organization like yours, organizations like ours, you have to be good at both, right? Because it exists, and you have to stop and influence, you have to stop what's happening today and then influence the future, so another really key point that you so eloquently articulated just now, so thank you for that too. So how have the issues progressed and changed since you started this organization over 30 years ago? And what's your perspective, of the situation here in Los Angeles?
Well, that's a big question, Lee.
Yeah.
So in some ways, they haven't changed that much. I think one way that one change is that I think there's much greater consensus now that housing is the solution to homelessness. And, a lot of consensus about housing first. But it's not like this is a new idea. I mean, we always knew housing was the solution, but there wasn't this degree of consensus. I think advocates knew that housing was a solution. Certainly many providers knew that, but early on we were really fighting not that we've won this fight conclusively, but fighting very vigorously the idea that people are homeless because they want to be. This was an idea that was perpetuated and really promoted during the Reagan administration and by the Reagan administration. And we had to really fight against that. So I think we've made headway there so that there is this consensus, but we still don't have the resources. We have a lot of models, like, for example, you're a wonderful model of how housing really can solve homelessness. And sometimes it's housing plus services, supportive housing, but housing is the underlying sort of foundation. But these are solutions that are not to scale. So there's still a lot of work to be done. At the same time, so that's good that we're moving in this direction. At the same time, there's also a lot more negative responses, like criminalization. The dominant response, I think, in many cities around the country, and that's a trend that's really grown over the years. But that's again, we can view that as an opportunity, because there is, criminalization also presents an opportunity for common ground. Cities don't like seeing people on the street. We don't think people should be on the street. Well, let's find common ground and figure out how to get there. And the common ground is housing. Now, in terms of LA, what I was trying to think about LA in the mid 80s. I remember there was a lot of conversation in LA then about SRO housing. There had been losses, and there were some early efforts, I think, in LA to pilot SRO housing for homeless people, which was very important. That was a kind of model at the time. And so now here you are, and not that it's SRO, I guess SRO has, not the term of the moment, but it is the concept of housing that is affordable and that is, sustainable for people. And let's see, what else? There was something else I wanted to say about LA. Oh, LA, the conversation about using resources that are now being spent on law enforcement to address homelessness. That's been a huge issue in LA, and there's been lots of fights, and we've been involved in some of them in court and other groups have been involved in court to strike down laws that criminalize homelessness. But there was also some really good news with the ballot initiative, Measure J, to use funding for housing and community services as opposed to law enforcement. So it's not just in LA, it was in a number of cities on the ballot in November. So that's another sort of positive hopeful development.
Yeah, that's you know, when you were kind of talking about like kind of the work that you had done in your 80s, and you mentioned Los Angeles and you mentioned us, you know, there's quite a few like instant messaging and texts that went off on my phone saying thank you. They were saying thank you to you for kind of calling out kind of our forefathers and our foremothers, you know, when Skid Row Housing Trust was born, which was, you know, in 85, you know, and the SRO concept, you know, which still exists today, it's a very effective model. It's a very complex model, you know, and it was equally complex, you know, in 2020 and currently because of the congregated spaces, but it was highly innovative then. And the people that worked so hard, you know, including, you know, the preceding CEO, which, you know, a gentleman by the name of Mike Alvadrez, you know, really just pushed so hard to make that work, you know, and continued to evolve that model to where it is today, to add programs, to add services, to expand. And, you know, in some cases it works, you know, great. And in some cases, you know, there are, you know, a couple of challenges, but still Los Angeles comes together and still tries to continue to work through those challenges. So if you could see the responses that I got, you know, so I'm extending gratitude from them to you for bringing out their history. You know, we have some employees that have been here for, you know, 15, 20 years, you know, so you made the team feel good. And I'm sure you made the people that were on our board or in leadership positions, you know, during that time feel good too. So thank you for doing that, because you understand, you know. Yes. Yeah, you understand.
Absolutely, I remember, and you know, LA has been, there's been a lot of work, and also in the legal arena. You know, Gary Blakey. I mean, there's been litigation early on in LA. So yes, I do know that, and I very much appreciate that all.
So you specifically have been very instrumental in enacting and implementing numerous federal laws addressing this crisis, the homelessness crisis. One of those being the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. That's the first, still only one of the major federal legislations that addresses homelessness. Can you talk and share and educate, you know, us and our audience what that act is, what it's achieved, and any other monumental legislation that you've helped either launch or create or facilitate?
Sure. So the Stewart, so at the time originally it was called the Stewart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act. Then it was renamed after Bruce Vento died to be the McKinney-Vento Act. At the time, this was really a huge deal. Because at the time, this was during the Reagan years, and Reagan, as I mentioned, was taking the position that people were homeless by choice. They just liked the fresh air. They liked to live outside. This wasn't an issue for the federal government at all. It was an issue at most for local government, but preferably for charity. So making the case that this was an issue for the federal government and for federal legislative action was tough. It was a new thing, and the enactment of this legislation eventually by Congress, you know, was a big deal. Reagan had to sign it because it was passed by overwhelming majorities in the House and the Senate. But he signed it in the evening to show his displeasure. So in any case, it was a big deal, but it was not what we needed. It was explicitly designed to be a first step. It was part one of this three-part piece that we had devised, a much more comprehensive proposal that we had. And this was primarily the part one, which was the primarily emergency response to homelessness. And the promise of Congress at the time of enactment was that this would just be the first step. In any case, it funded primarily emergency shelter, which we knew then was not the solution. It was just a Band-Aid, but it was still very important. It, for the first time there was federal money going out to communities to address the crisis. And then, over time, the funding has increased pretty dramatically, but it's still not nearly at scale, still not nearly enough to replace all the housing cuts that had ushered in mass homelessness to begin with in the early 80s. So, over time, we pushed for additional steps, but they were not forthcoming. What we did was we worked to get homelessness included in mainstream programs. So, for example, we got provisions into the IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, for homeless kids. We got provisions into Head Start for homeless toddlers. So a kind of strategic approach in that way, in that sort of targeted way. We also wanted to address the causes. So that was the whole idea. We have to address the causes of homelessness to prevent people from becoming homeless. And we worked to on the Violence Against Women Act. That was a big push to get housing included there. And that was first in 2005, and then that was expanded in 2013. So that, domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for women in particular. And that was an opportunity, again, this approach of latching on to larger programs. So we worked on that, and that I think was a big piece of a big legislative victory. Similarly, during the foreclosure crisis, when a lot of people became homeless as a result of that, and so we again worked as part of a larger issue and a larger coalition, and worked on the Protecting Tenants from Foreclosure Act. So we focused on tenants as the more vulnerable group of people affected by the crisis. So those are some examples of other legislative efforts. Now, right now, we're working on something called the Housing as a Human Right Act. And that is legislation pending now. Actually, it's about to be pending it's about to be reintroduced in the new Congress, but it had been introduced last year by Congresswoman Jayapal from Washington State. And it is legislation to increase housing, funding for housing for people who are homeless, and to decrease criminalization. And so that's something we're very involved with and focused on. So those are some of our initiatives. I mentioned already the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, and that's a big focus. That's primarily a local level initiative.
Yeah, again, kind of pointing out to some of the conversation pieces you have, the data points that you have, and laying that out, how, like, what contributes to homelessness, and there's a lot of people that really don't understand, because there's this preconceived notion, and again, you eloquently you very gently split how do you take the current homeless population and lift them out of it, which, organization like ours, that's, our mission, and that's, what we're focused on. But then organizations like ours have, years of data and experience and stories, and, residents that can share their stories, and partners like yourself to say, what caused it in the first place, and how do you get ahead of that? Because there's an obligation, there's a duty, there's a responsibility to mitigate it from in individuals, families, from slipping into homelessness in the first place. Because once that occurs, that's a very difficult climb to come out of, you know, emotionally, financially, physically, all of it, and so again, you kind of pointed that out, and I think that, this audience that, that we have today is very empathetic and understands that, but it's really just the conversion of that to action, and I think you point that out, and really continuing the discussion at the highest level, at policy, at the grassroots level where it's occurring, and we understand and bring those together in an appropriate and timely fashion, so that one isn't moving without the other, or doesn't fulfill the need in the first place. So so thank you for doing that. Thank you for not just articulating that, but you're taking the actions, and we spend a lot of time on how do you lift out, how do you mitigate anyone falling into it in the first place. So would really enjoy continuing discussing around both of those components, with you and your organization. So so again, very grateful for you to articulate that. So jumping into a little bit what you touched on in the very beginning and just now is, just around the criminalization of homelessness, when people have nowhere to go, they could be, and not just Los Angeles, we're talking everywhere, they can be arrested for sleeping or eating or sitting in public, things that, you had said before, and not even understanding how maybe that person arrived to that place in the first place. Taxpayer dollars, are used, to arrest or fine, jail, individuals like that exacerbates homelessness even further.
Right, exactly. I lost you for part of that, but I think you were asking, so what?
I can repeat it.
Just the question part of it. I know.
Yeah.
I got the gist.
Yeah, what could you share some of the data or perspective or experience or stats, on this the criminalizing homelessness and how it exacerbates homelessness even further?
Sure. So this is a trend, and this is a trend that's been going on for a long time. We have been documenting it really since our inception. But most recently, we put out national reports where we look at laws that criminalize homelessness across the country. And our most recent one is called Housing Not Handcuffs. It's a 2019 look at these laws, and we're seeing increases. We've been looking at the same 187 cities now since 2006. So we can map out trends over time, and the trends are in the direction of increases, and in some cases really dramatic ones. The most dramatic increase in the types of laws has been laws that make it a crime to sleep in your vehicle, and those laws have increased by over 200% in 10 years. So that's a big increase, and that probably speaks to the reality that more and more people are sleeping in their cars. And as housing becomes more, and this is certainly true in California, but not only in California, but certainly there, that more people are being priced out, they're squeezed out of housing, and they're sleeping in their cars. And many cities have responded by making this a crime. You can be fined, you can be ticketed, you can be arrested, you can be towed, you might lose your car, it might be impounded. But all of the and you know, across the board, these types of laws making it a crime to live in public places are on the rise. It's not a good idea because it's makes it harder, for one thing, for people to exit homelessness if they have an arrest record. It's much harder to get into housing, it's harder to get a job, it's sometimes harder to get even public benefits if you have an arrest record or a conviction. So this is very counterproductive. It makes homelessness worse. It's not a good, it's obviously not an effective strategy. It doesn't end homelessness for anyone. At most, it will force someone to leave a particular spot on the street and move somewhere else. It's also very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
It's more for cities to deploy their police to arrest people for sleeping when they have no choice, really, than it is to actually provide housing. Plus, it could be unconstitutional. These are cases we've litigated. We recently had a big victory in the Ninth Circuit, which is your circuit, where California is. Mm-hmm. It includes 8 other states. In the Martin v. Boise case, that said that it's violates the U.S. Constitution to criminally punish somebody for sleeping outside when they have no indoor alternative. Mm-hmm. So this is not a good approach, is the bottom line. And, you know, in terms of stats, you know, the most important stat that we are increasingly developing is the cost. You know, that it costs so much more to criminalize than it does to actually solve the problem. And there have been a number of cost studies in communities around the country that show this. So I can't reel them off the top of my head.
Yeah, no. The statistic you gave us earlier was enough. Like just it was indicative enough when you said those cities had a 200% increase over 10 years. That alone was like, I mean, just when you hear those numbers and then you can translate that to effect, on human lives, it's just, it just is, you always think that you can't be surprised, but you just get surprised, so that was some information. So thank you for that again. Yeah, your organization, actually put out a first 100-day priorities or priority list to end homelessness in America for President Biden. What do you believe are the necessary priorities? And can you just share a little bit of what that was?
Sure. So some of them are already being acted on. They include points like an evidence-based approach to homelessness, a removal of the person who had been in had been put in place as the head of the U.S. Interagency Council, who was explicitly against housing first. So that has happened. That's good. But the bigger item is we want the administration to make good on its commitment that housing is a right. So the Biden administration actually included in its platform and in its policy document on housing that it believes that housing is a right, not a privilege. And that's huge. That is a really important step for an incoming administration to actually say this. And, we were really happy during the run-up, during the election campaigns, that a number of the candidates actually articulated that housing should be a right. And, we've been saying this for decades, and now finally it's entering the mainstream where people are actually saying this. Major political figures are saying this. So that is huge. But now we need the administration to actually turn this into some concrete proposals. And in the proposal for the COVID relief package, there are significant increases in funding for housing, and there's a proposal to make for a universal housing voucher program, so that whoever is poor enough to be eligible for a housing voucher will actually receive it. If this happens, this will again be huge, because we know that right now only 1 in 4 of people who are poor enough to be eligible for housing assistance, federal housing assistance, actually receives it, because there's not enough funding. So making this really a right that, an entitlement, if you meet the criteria, you get a housing voucher, that would be huge. And it's in the proposal. It is in our recommendation. You asked about our recommendations, and I jumped to what is actually in there. But yes, this is something that we are recommending and would like to see happen. So those are some of the key. And then we also want to see homelessness not be criminalized. There are things that the federal government can do. The federal government can use the power of the purse. It can use its funding authority to discourage cities from criminalizing homelessness, and we wanted to do that. We're also we're recommending right to counsel in housing court. Again, this is something that happens at the local level, but it can be promoted and funded by the federal government. And this is something that can make an enormous difference in preventing homelessness to begin with. And they're models of this. And there are also cost studies. It also saves money.
Yeah.
Providing a lawyer to somebody in housing court when they're about to be evicted can make a big difference about whether they end up staying in their housing or they end up losing it and potentially becoming homeless.
Well, we're on our last question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I forgot to mention something. We also had a point about children, making sure that homeless children are able to attend school, especially now during the COVID crisis, and the extension of the eviction moratorium, which is something that has actually happened. Oh, I keep thinking of I should have printed this out and have it in front of me, but I keep thinking of other things. The CDC guidelines, we wanted the CDC guidelines to be made mandatory. The CDC guidelines that require placement in individual housing rather than sweeping encampments, and rather than congregate shelters. So I think those are the basic points.
Well, those were a lot, and influential and impactful, and to your point, some are in motion and just needs to keep, fighting to move it forward, and some of them are new and are landing, perhaps on the right ears to help facilitate that to action, too. So, well, thank you for hanging in there too. We took a little bit longer than we thought we were going to, but very, very much appreciate it. And we are on the last question. So,
Sure.
You've been leading your organization, for 31 years, and just recently announced that this would be your last year. So that's like so bittersweet for us to hear. Can't even imagine how that feels for you. But what is next for you, and what are your hopes for the National Homelessness Law Center, in the future and upcoming years?
Sure. Excuse me. So what's next for me is, and you're right, it is bittersweet, but I'm excited about my plans for my next chapter. So I am planning to write a book, and I'd like to address some of the same kinds of issues we've been talking about, because I have been involved in this for such a long time. I'd like to share some of what I've learned, and will be excited to do that. I am very happy and excited that I have a Bellagio residency through the Rockefeller Foundation to work on the book.
Wow.
I hope I'll be able to actually go. I was supposed to have gone last year, but COVID prevented that. But hopefully this year it'll happen. And so that's my immediate plan. I also have been teaching. A few years ago, I began teaching a seminar at Columbia Law School on law and policy of homelessness, and I'd like to continue to do that. So that's on my agenda.
That's awesome.
Yeah, the basic idea is at this point, make a shift. I will remain committed. Obviously, I'm committed to the issue and to the fight, but I'd like to kind of move it more into a mode of sharing what I've learned with the new generation of activists. And that's what I plan to do. And I'm very excited. I'll actually be stepping down in a few months in April. I'm very excited that we recently concluded our search. We conducted a search for my successor. We had wonderful applicants, which was really gratifying. We've identified my successor. We'll be making an announcement soon, and I'm very thrilled with the person who will be taking the helm. And my hope is to build on the successes that we've had, and to especially to build on partnerships that we established, because those are so critical. And so I hope we'll continue to do that, and there is much more work to still be done. But I feel like we're at a good point. I feel like we're hopefully, about to turn a corner, and I'm excited about that.
Well, on behalf of us, which I'm sure everyone's extending it to you, thank you for everything you did and are doing and will continue to do on behalf of homelessness. Thanks for all of your legal work, all your passion, all your commitment. Thank you for today, and allowing us to be one of the environments that you present yourself, in this role as you transition out of it. So it's been such a pleasure, talking to you. We really enjoyed learning. Like I said, there's some instant messaging and some text going on right now that is just really extending their gratitude, not just for your fight, but for your grace, in the way that you managed the fight. And good luck to you. We hope we'll follow you. We'll stay connected to the organization, obviously, but thank you for today. Thank you for the 30+ years. Thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for being just an outstanding model. So very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do. I really mean it. I appreciate it. It's a joint effort.
Yes, very much so. And with that, we're going to wrap up our Q&A, a moderated conversation with Maria. Thank you, Maria, and we will hope to connect soon with you and your organization in separate paths. And at this point, I am going to turn it back over to Jet and slide 6. I believe it's slide 6, and she will take it over from there.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, Maria. Maria, everyone on our side was so excited, hearing you share your work and really connecting the horizon of your career since you left Sullivan and Cromwell with the arc of Skid Row Housing Trust. We were one of the early organizations that was founded to preserve SRO housing stock long before we became a developer of permanent supportive housing. And it was just phenomenal, really, to hear your story and to have the context of the work that you're currently doing. So thank you. We always have calls to action as part of this meeting before we go to Q&A. And so for our audience, you know, we always ask if you have the ability to do so or ask a friend to do so. Any gift of any amount supports our work and helps us bring our unhoused neighbors home and keep our unhoused neighbors housed. And the funding structures for this type of work are just, you know, have never really been adequate. So we have terrific news to share that some of our donors to do something to end homelessness have already seen, but we're really excited to share with our supporters what's going on right now, bringing unhoused neighbors home. Also, if you are not currently on our mailing list, we hope you will click the link on your screen and sign up. That is an important mechanism for us to stay in touch with our supporters. And with that, I'm going to go to Q&A. And we have a Skid Row Housing Trust celebrity with the first question. I have Mike Alvidrez, Lee's predecessor and our CEO Emeritus and Ambassador on the line. And I think he has something he'd like to ask Maria.
Great.
Maria, let me add my thanks to you and your organization for all the many years of hard work that you've done on behalf of homeless people. We know, those of us that actually create housing, we know that we could not have done this unless we had our colleague legal advocates taking the case through the courts to make sure that homeless people are not denied their rights or are not criminalized for simply not being able to afford a place to live. So thank you again for your many years of service, and I wish you well on your next adventure. My question to you is, and I think I'm a little bit paraphrasing Cushing Dolbear, who mentioned that a right to housing only makes sense if there's an opportunity for housing. So we see people, even when they have a right to housing, can't find a place to live. Even when there are Section 8 certificates or vouchers that they might receive, simply can't find anyone who would accept those vouchers so they can get into a housing unit that they can afford. My question to you is, do you believe that there ought to be some sort of mandate for states to create, not just states, but counties and cities, to create a baseline of affordable housing within their respective jurisdictions so that right to housing can actually be realized through an opportunity for housing?
Yes.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's a right would be hollow if the housing wasn't there, or if the housing was there but people couldn't gain access to it. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many examples of people who have vouchers. Vouchers are very hard to get right now, but even people who are able finally to get one and then they can't use it. It's just terrible. And what is the solution? And there are solutions to this. There are laws that can prevent source of income discrimination, which is often the problem. So you can mandate that a landlord can't just arbitrarily turn away someone because they have a voucher. But then you also need to back that up. I mean, these rights are also hollow if people don't know that they have them, and if they don't have the wherewithal to actually enforce them, and they need access to lawyers. I mean, I talked about the right to counsel in eviction court, which is very critical, but it's more than that. I mean, legal services need to be funded adequately so that people can have access to lawyers if they are turned away inappropriately or illegally from using their housing vouchers. So there are a lot of different issues that need to be addressed to make rights real.
Well, thank you for that answer. And have you thought about moving to Los Angeles to carry out the rest of your activities? We sure could use your help out here. As you know, we are the epicenter of homelessness in the entire country.
I have heard.
While there are great strides being made, hopefully we're going to have some good news from the new administration in Washington. to actually create more of those opportunities for people so they can get off the street. So again, thank you for your service to our community and our country, really, and my personal thanks to you as well. And I will sign off so I don't get in the way of any other questioners. So thank you again.
Okay, thanks so much.
Mike, thanks for that. Maria, I'm sure you can tell why we love Mike so much. He's always closing.
Great.
We have another question for you from a close friend of the Trust. Our very good friend, Zach Worma, who is the Public Affairs Director at our, fellow Skid Row partner organization, Downtown Women's Center, is here with us today. And Zach has a question for you as well.
Great, okay.
Maria, again, thank you so much for spending time with the Skid Row Housing Trust community today. You'll often hear sort of heated sort of public rhetoric, quite often from the public, but even sometimes from policymakers, that the sort of misconception that unhoused people have additional rights, or this notion of homeowners are sort of at a disadvantage. And I'm just sort of curious from kind of your perspective of what do you think the most common kind of legal misconception about homelessness is that is either in the minds of the public or even policymakers? And so for us as kind of advocates for our unhoused neighbors, like what should we be doing to sort of help dispel those myths?
Well, so in my experience, the most common and unhelpful myth is that people are homeless because they want to be homeless, that help is available and people just refuse it. And that is absolutely not true. And that, I think, is the most important myth we all have to dispel, that these issues are real, they're structural, they're not the fault of individuals. Everybody who becomes homeless has their individual path that leads them to that, but that doesn't mean that it's an individual failing, it's a societal failing, and we've got to see that. And that's the myth we've got to dispel. And you mentioned homeowners. Homeowners actually do have a right to housing. They have a right to a tax deduction. That's a right, it's an entitlement. The homeowners, the mortgage interest deduction is a right that subsidizes homeowners in their housing. And I don't think that we want to get into a fight with homeowners. It's just a way to illustrate that, our society makes choices about what it's going to invest resources in. And right now, there are resources invested to support home ownership because we've decided that that's a priority. And those resources are not being invested in housing for poor people because that's not viewed as a priority. And we've got to shift that so that housing for everybody is a priority. It's a basic human need, and it is, it should be recognized as a basic human right.
Thank you so much.
All right, Zach, thank you. Mike, thank you. Maria, thank you. Lee, thank you. I hope that everybody, in our audience and the people we share this recording with later enjoyed this as much as I did. This was phenomenal, and these can be really difficult topics, but you've done a beautiful job outlining them and making them vivid and real for people to grasp. Our next meeting, I'm so excited to announce this. Our guest will be newly elected Supervisor Holly J. Mitchell, and we'll be talking to her about her historic election, making the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors one of the most powerful women-led elected bodies, certainly in the United States, and discussing her, views and plans for Supervisor District 2 and helping us understand more about, what the county is doing in the housing and services space. That meeting will take place Wednesday, February 24th at 12:15 p.m. And we hope to see all of you and your friends there. So thanks everybody for joining us. We appreciate your investment in understanding this work.
Thank you, Jet.
Thanks, Lee. Bye, everyone.